Okay, so the IPA history was Indian Pale Ale. So it was basically brewed in the 18th and 19th century and started basically in London. We exported a lot more porter really than what we did IPA, but it was found that by increasing the alcohol strength and then also increasing the bitterness and the hoppiness of it, the IPAs would also last the journey. As time went on, it started getting brewed more around the country as well, and Burton became the home of the IPA. Now the water in Burton was really high in sulfates, so that really brought out the bitterness within the beer, and also the extra calcium sulfate within the water probably going to have lowered the pH lower than what you'd have got in London, and that's also going to help it last its journey. So the beer style was quite a lot of fruity esters and a lot of basically English earthy hops in there. Alcohol would have been between 5 to 7%, and the bitterness around about, well, between 40 and 75. As time moves on, as we come to the 20th century, the alcohol steadily begins to decline. Now, there's a couple of reasons for this. Taste styles may well have changed, but we had taxation on the original gravity of beers. So it started costing quite a lot of money to create the extra high strength beers. And we also had a couple of world wars, which put quite a lot of strain on actually providing malt to the brewers. The IPAs were not a traditional beer. They were basically a bitter, a stronger version of bitter, but they still were brewed with a lot of imported malts and hops. As we passed through then, in the 1970s, the 1980s, the American homebrew revolution kind of took off, and we started getting a lot of craft brewers being produced in America. Now, the beers that were around America at that point were generally lots of light lagers, and it cost quite a lot of money to go off and buy the expensive refrigeration that you need, and also the tanks that you need to age it. And there wasn't a lot of money knocking about to be able to open the breweries, so ales became the obvious choice. Didn't really want to start importing any materials from the UK or Europe, mainly because it was so expensive. So the brewers needed to find their own little niche in the market. Now, the US malts at the time were quite lightly flavoured, but the hops were very different. And basically, the West Coast IPA was kind of born. That was basically the American IPA, which was very heavily dry hopped, had a really cut-in bitterness and dry finish. But then, as we led on after that, we basically got to the bitterness race where everybody just wanted to make the beers as bitter as possible. Now, as that's ongoing, and as you go through, you do the research on this, there's quite a few other brewers that say, oh, we brewed this beer before them. But the general consensus is around 2000, a small brew pub in Vermont, called The Alchemist, brewed a beer called the Hidley Topper. Now, this was basically brewing a beer without any thought of making it bright at the end. So didn't really have to worry about blinding filters or isinglass making everything nice and bright. And they also wanted to keep it really nice and smooth. Now, the beer style started to take off around New England, but it kind of stayed in there as a taproom style. It was a little bit too fragile to put into can and send off, or put into small pack to send it away, mainly because it started to drop bright and people thought, oh, that's not right anymore. Then as time comes on, around about 2015, I think it was first introduced for judging at the Beer World Cup, and no one really knew what to do about it. And then in 2017, hazy IPAs and juicy IPAs were actually recognised as their own style. Now, another thing that really allowed the NEIPA and the juicy IPAs to take off is basically the hops that were available. So in the beginning, the Cascade, Centennial, Columbus and Chinook were the backbone of the brewing, the craft beer brewing industry. really, really nice hops, and they basically were the go-to hops. But then, as time goes on through the early 2000s, we get some really, really big, juicy hops being released. So we've got Simcoe coming along, Amarillo, Citra, the Big Daddy, Galaxy, and then Mosaic at the end. And you can see at the bottom on the table that more and more hops became available. In 2012, the hop acreage between Alpha and Aroma hops was 50-50. And then moving on to last year, it's a lot more on the side of Aroma hops. We also learn a little bit more about biotransformation and what goes on within the beer to bring out the juiciness within the hops. The biotransformation is basically quite simply when you start with one thing and you end up with something else. So 4 of those that go on in beer is the modification of terpenes, which is basically 80% of the oils, and that's from geraniol into citronella, so really, really citrus aromas. We get the conversion of organic acids into esters, so again, we're getting a lot more fruity flavours coming through from esters. We get thiols. Generally, a lot of the sulfur compounds within yeast are going to give you vegetable flavours that you don't particularly want, but thiols have tropical flavours in them, and biotransformation releases them and allows them to be more prevalent. And then we get glycosides, which are basically a carbohydrate and aglycone. As they're carved up by yeast, it releases the aromatic components of that, and again, just makes the flavour a little bit of a boost. So going on to what an IPA is and the things that we're looking for. In its appearance, hazy. We're not bothered about it being bright, but we don't particularly want that to be a yeasty haze. We want it to be a nice protein haze. It can be orange and golden in colour, although these days as well, we're going very, very pale with that. And we get this really, really nice, dense, creamy head. The aroma is all about being blown away. When you take that sniff in the glass, it really wants you to blow your mind and think, wow, what's going on? And that's full of tropical and fruity flavours. Malt character is pretty neutral, but we need to build the grist up to make sure that it can handle all the hops that's going in and really add to the full body flavour that we want. Flavour, obviously hop forwards, lots of fruity esters from the yeast. We're going to use a lot of tropical fruity hops, and we don't want the bitterness coming through. So whereas we're seeing normal IPAs ranging from 50 upwards, the New England IPAs are going to be more around 20 bitterness units, so really, really low. Then the mouthfeel, really, really soft, silky, and often described as pillowy, and chewy, full body with not a lot of carbonation. So then we actually come on to putting the recipe together. So as we said at the start, a lot of IPAs, very, very bitter, and a lot of sulfates in there, in the water, to extenuate that dryness and the bitterness. And sulfate brings that. Chloride, on the other hand, improves palate fullness and gives a mellow flavour. So it's often thought, oh, if you're brewing a bitter, you have to have a sulfate level of 2 to 1, and if you're brewing a porter, you want a sulfate level of the opposite way around. Generally, looking back to the attributes that we want to brew for the New England IPA, we want to go heavy on the chlorides. So we generally want to be 2 to 1 chloride to sulfate to really bring out the smoothness. And there's also a little bit of sodium chloride that could be added. And again, if you wanted to improve any sweetness and fullness, but do be careful because it can go salty to higher levels. So, Mark, if you want to come in at this point and kind of say what you do as you were building a recipe for a hazy or a New England IPA.
Yeah, of course. I mean, as you said, grist selection really is a starting point, I think, for most places. But I think if you really, really want to think about where to begin to start thinking about a New England IPA, or particularly a big soft IPA at the moment, it's hop selection. We start. Sorry, Ben?
Just worry about the water at a minute in time, then we'll come on to that.
Oh, Mike, I was excited about hops. That's what we talk about. Fine, water, crucial every time. As Mike was saying, 2 to 1 classically for chloride to sulfate in favour of chlorides for a porter. We've used chlorides for palate softness as up to sort of 200 to 250 ppm, which is very, very high. And you're going to see some effects with that in the mash tun. So if you are going that high, I'd recommend sort of monitoring yourself against malted to unmalted grains as well. You're going to see a pH sort of pickup, which might need a bit of acidification at that point. I've also found perhaps breaking your water chemistry down, getting away things like DWB or certain premixed acids. I know Murphy's AMS is always a popular one, but perhaps individually adding different versions of lactic against citric, against phosphoric acid to sort of balance that water profile against what you'd like. What that will enable you to do is not only target exactly the sort of palate fullness, pillowy sort of texture you were talking about, but also exactly aim on your extraction. You want to start aiming to have sort of a roundabout a finishing gravity of about, I think you've got 1015 to sort of 1020. I've seen them as high as 1030 recently. To do that, you start looking at your acidification against your calcium and chloride levels in the mash tun from a chemistry point of view. That's really, really crucial.
It's you can also get quite a lot of pickup from the malt as well on that when you're worried about your water chemistry. I think malt can add between 50 and 100 ppm to that as well. But Carl, have you got anything else to add on that?
Not really. No, I think you kind of covered it there. The important thing is sort of keep the sulfates lower and the chlorides higher, and that just gives it that juiciness and that fullness. And as you say, it's something we want to try and find out a little bit more about in terms of malt, because I think malts are made in different places, can have different contributions of ions. So that's something that, as you said, you need to keep an eye on and factor that in to your calculations for your salts as you point them in.
When we brought Blue Moon over to the UK, it was the whole setup for the water dosing in the brewery that I was at was all about sulfate 2 to 1 chlorides, and we had to completely swap the ratio around to be able to get Blue Moon passed off. So you could see there's really big differences that do come in when you do swap the ratio over. Okay, so some things to worry about as well on the back of water is the pH within the beer. So when we're dry hopping, dry hopping can increase the pH quite significantly. I've seen it rise up to 2 units of pH. And if you do get poor head retention, do get poor high pHs, you can get poor head retention. You can get the beer being susceptible to microcontamination, even though you're adding quite a lot of hops that might combat this. And as well, if the pH rises, you perceive bitterness and mouthfeel can go up and give a slightly soapy character. And I think it can also affect the haze quite a bit. I wonder if you've seen any issues with the pH and controlling the haze, Mark.
Not particularly linked to haze so much, but it is something that you've got to be very aware of, particularly if you're going for that softer mouthfeel and you want to extract those hops. I wouldn't recommend trying to acidify beer after the fact and just try and keep the process as natural as possible. So I'd possibly look at, again, doing most of your work in your mash tun leading up to your copper. It's not doing anything post-ferment. As long as you've got a good, clean fermentation out of the way, then you should be okay. And you've seen a decent drop for that first couple of days, maybe down to sort of sub 4 during primary ferment. Then if you're biotransforming or adding hops later on into your cellaring process, I wouldn't be too concerned about pH pickup. We certainly can put out beers at about 4.5 to 4.6 pH and not see any issues with head retention or hazing issues. Again, it becomes a different thing altogether if you're going into that 8, 7, 8, 9% category, especially the amount of hops you're having to balance out against yeast content. It really is sort of a tricky game to play. So I've never been too worried about it by the time it gets into final impact. Again, the benefit of that is you probably are carrying a lot of yeast over at that, so that's giving you a certain amount of yeast haze and protein haze, and that 8 7-8% is really going to, bolster anything the pH did take out of it for sterility or safety process.
Super. Yeah, I've definitely seen the pH rise. We was filtering the beer and it gave a little bit of problems, probably because we were filtering it. Carl, have you got anything on that as well?
Not on that one. No, to be honest, in my brewing career, I never brewed one. But I know that pH and like the theory says that haze and yeast, proteins, this kind of thing, the things that are causing the haze are quite sensitive to pH. It's the isoelectric points and that kind of thing. So if you are finding that you're getting it cleared in too soon, unexpectedly, it's dropping out. And as Mark says, what you need to do is get your brewing right, sort things out in the mash tun with your calcium levels, your acidification of your mash liquor if needs be, and then aim for getting 4 or below at the end of fermentation, and that gives you that little bit of scope to get the hops in there and take that increase. So, yeah.
Okay, so now we come on to the fun parts. So the grists, this is the foundations of the NEIPA. While we know what's going to go on with the hops, you need the grist selection to be able to back it up. So the first thing you need to do is make sure you choose a really good, high quality base malt. And you've still got quite a lot of different options around choosing that base malt that's going to give you different effects on the style. So if you decided to go with Marisotto, it's going to give you a really full flavour and nice, possibly biscuity tone to it as well. Something the other scale, Clear Choice, is really, really good body to it and a really, really smooth finish. So as we're going to plough in a load of polyphenols, dry hopping that might raise that bitterness, something like Clear Choice can really smooth it out. Chevalier, one of the malts that would have been the original IPA, massive, massive body towards it. But you know what? A standard pale, best ale is still going to give really, really good results. And depending on what you want to brew and what you get out of it, you've still got quite a lot of selection over your malts. Boosting body, we can use dextrin, which is going to give you good head retention and push that body and mouthfeel. And the same with caramel as well. And caramel, I found with NEIPAs, actually brings out quite a lot of kind of a nice sweetness to it to back up some of the hops that go in. So I found using caramel quite a nice little addition to the beers that I brewed. So yeah, Mark.
So I quite agree. We keep with one sort of malt, just a best ale malt. Tends to be our normal spec. We're certainly driving it a bit lighter at the moment. It tends to be a lot of feedback from what we're getting from a lot of other breweries, and certainly our consumers are wanting lighter, paler beers as a primary base. It depends on how you're doing your protein stand. I like the idea of using Clear Choice because you've also got that quite low polyphenol and protein count in there, or lower than most. It's quite unmodified. So you could build in quite a decent level of haze and maybe have a bit more control over that. I see a lot of guys at the moment using chip malts and dextrin. There's not much difference between them as far as I know. Certainly, even things adding like torrefied wheats, torrefied barley, because you're not having that proteolysis with malting and modification during malting. You've still got quite a lot of protein there, which you can use and extract. That, along with oats, can be at the moment for us sometimes as high as 35 to 40% of the grist, which is very, very high. Obviously, with oat, you've got the beta glucan in there, so you've got to be very careful with your mash tun, really down to your brewers to it. So a lot of that we've used into there. Vienna's coming back in a big way as well. I see into a lot of sort of big juicy IPAs. You're getting that sort of lovely sort of vivid orange sheen, sort of an orangey sort of class to it, rather than that clear, almost pale translucence that was going on last year with a lot of breweries. So I think a lot of people are going to be adding things like Munich and Vienna in there, some of the more heritage malts, to sort of get a little bit of a different twist on there. And it gives you a very different body to play around with.
That's interesting.
Really nice.
Yeah, that's cool.
Lovely colour on them.
Yeah, indeed.
Anything on? There's another slide in a minute on wheat and stuff like that. But have you got anything on top of that, Carl?
No, I think we've covered it there. The key thing I think is that I'm pretty sure you come on to mash temperatures a bit later as well. But it's about mashing at the right temperature, the right thickness, with obviously the blend of malted and unmalted cereals, not just barley. and that then just creates this body. And as Mark says, ultimately you want to be finishing certainly 15 and above, and that just gives you that fullness in the palate. So those are the things to keep in mind. And obviously we'll talk about the other cereals in a minute.
Okay. Yeah. And as we move on, it's really, really good to use a mixture of malted and non-malted cereals. There is a difference between them all. Wheats, for instance, torrefied wheats, quite neutral in flavour, whereas malted wheats, you kind of like a little bit more smoothness to it. But in general, wheat's also going to improve the mouthfeel no matter which one you use. Head retention will also give you a little bit more haze potential as well. Oats is it's the staple at the minute in time of all the NEIPAs. Lots of creaminess and mouthfeel from it, and as Mark said, using up to 20-30% these days. Yeah. And then rye as well. Again, I quite like rye in small instances. It can give some quite nice toffee caramel notes, again, just to kind of smooth out the flavour. That little bit of mouthfeel as well.
Yeah, I think generally with the rye, you just need to keep below 5%.
Yeah.
Because otherwise it does start to get that slight spiciness, which you might be looking for. Could be an interesting sort of take on it, but yeah, if you're wanting that toffee caramel, then stay below 5%, you'll be all right. I think the oats, just push it as far as you can without impacting on runoff and getting sticky mashes and that kind of thing. Yeah. You can use rice hulls or oat hulls to keep the bed open. That tends to help a little bit.
Right, so now you can come on to hops, Mark. So the hops that we're going to go after, they're going to be nice, big tropical fruits, but we also don't particularly want to just concentrate on those. There are other hops that work really, really well with them and help bring out their flavours. We might want to select varieties that encourage biotransformation. I think Eldorado's one. And we also want to think about where the hops are best added. So Rakow, I think, was one in the past that was better in the kettle than in the dry hop for what we were brewing. And then really want to think about supply as well. If it's just a one-off special, then whatever's on the open market. But if it's going to be something that you're going to rebrew again, then you might want to think about what you can actually get. It's quite important to speak to your hop supplier and get a little information around them. The hop addition to the kettle, we're basically not going to put anything at the start. It's just kind of like a little handful, just to control the foil and stop any boil over. Towards the end of the boil, right at the end of the boil, is a different matter. That's where most of the loading is going to come. And by moving it later on, we're going to get some smoother, softer bitternesses, and we're going to get lots of aroma. And we can increase that as well. If we cool down the worts at the end of the stands, whirlpool stand, down to 80, we can stop any isomerization and keep them all oils in solution and bump up the aroma. And to make sure that we control the haze in the final pack, we don't particularly want to be adding kettle finings at that point anyway. We don't particularly want to control a lot of the proteins that we're going to need for and polyphenols that we're going to need for the haze to form later on. Mark, you're away now. Go.
Thank you. No, I mean, I think it's sometimes you forget just how crucial it is to get a really decent boil out of a sort of a hazy beer or a New England beer. Of course, don't add kettle finings. It would be best not to, but you do need to get some trub formation. And because you're not adding something to solubilize them, I'd recommend, possibly even increasing your boil time a little bit more. You've got quite a lot. You've got a lot of grist in there you need to work with, particularly the amount of unmalted cereals you're with, and it can give you further complications down in ferment. Particularly if you're looking at adding hops during ferment, biotransformation, it can stall out your ferment a little bit easier, even with pH pickups. I've seen guys do it sort of like day 1, day 2, as a lot of books recommending. But if your yeast has just got going, it's just starting to acidify its wort, and then you're knocking your pH into it, it's not going to be a happy thing at all. So I think a good boil is really, really crucial to a lot of it. Then, as you said, there's lower IBUs you can hope to get. Some in there does help to also balance it. I think the key thing about where to use hops is, as you say, the hop selection, the hops you're using. So, you know, we really want to get those files out of there, those heat liable files. So look at your file content, look at what you're working with, and sort of aim to target that sort of thing. I think if you take something like El Dorado, it's got a really beautiful sort of like a summer strawberry mandarin sort of flavor, which you can use sort of further on, or you can use later on, and you get a very different sort of extraction from that point. Possibly a bit more blossomy, a bit more sort of sweet honeyed, rather than just go for sort of like a harsh, bitter sort of flavor. And a lot of that would be down to where you're using the hop in the process.
You still want to get biotransformation as well, Brian. You've got the thiols coming from the hot side, aren't you? Brian, they're in the wort, and there's...
They can do. I think a lot of biotransformation gets caught up with the fact that people, whilst you're putting it in active, obviously yeast is assimilating and changing hop characteristics, being myrcene, thiols, terpenes, myrcenes, or any of the sort of main sort of oil groups. A lot of it, I think, is also down to mechanics. If you dry hop something at 16, 17 degrees, the hop pellet's going to take longer to break down. You're going to need to agitate that a lot more aggressively. Whereas if you are doing it in primary ferment, you've got a lot more temperature there. You know, if that 5 degrees makes quite a bit of difference, as well as the movement within the beer itself. You know, you've got a lot of physical energy going in there. So I've always felt that the mechanics are a bit more important than the chemistry at that particular point. Also, you tend to be picking hops because of what they smell like out of room temperature, out of cold. If you want to extract that sort of juicy, lychee sort of flavour from citra rather than the harsh sort of lemony, sort of lemongrass sort of flavour you can get out of it, then perhaps use it a little bit colder, but look at doing it with a bit more agitation.
Okay, interesting.
Carl, anything to add?
No, you've covered it all on that one. Yeah, that's all good.
Awesome. Okay, right. So, yeah, yeast, is that the right one? Yeah. So, yeast. So, along with the big tropical flavors we want from the hops, we also want the yeast to add a little bit as well. So, normally, if you're doing a West Coast IPA or even a standard British IPA, you're probably going to use a nice neutral yeast. With New England IPAs, you want these fruity esters coming out, and you kind of want a little bit medium attenuation. As we said a few times, we want to leave the final gravity higher. So we don't want a highly attenuated yeast. We might want to pick yeast that encourages biotransformation. And it's also quite a good idea to mix the yeast. So if you've got a yeast that you've got a house strain you want to use that's particularly it's quite good attenuation, it's still okay to use that, but add a separate yeast to it that can add a little bit of ester profile to it as well. Just watch your yeast management at the end. So yeah, the yeast selection is basically fruity esters and medium attenuation, and kind of making your process work for those. So Mark, you use your house yeast for most of your NEIPAs, don't you?
Yeah, we use a top cropping English strain for pretty much most of our work actually. It's quite low attenuating, so we've got good control over that. Some NEIPAs recently we've used even sort of lower ones, certainly ones that can't ferment maltotriose, and a lot of that's done in the mash tun. So in offsetting that, you can actually have a lower mash tun temperature. You can have a sort of a different extraction, particularly less of a worry for things like glucan lock for oats and stuff. If you want to use that higher temperature in an English strain, if you want to use a lower one, you can get away with perhaps not using so much oats and go for something like chit or dextrin to give you that sort of clean ferment through there. I much prefer getting a good ferment out of the way and then flavouring the wort, as it were, with hops. Much biotransformation. A lot of our cask beers we biotransform, mainly down to necessity. They're in open top fermenters. But you do tend to get quite a harsh extraction out of it, which is good for some of our more traditional cask beers. But for things that are a bit softer, a bit juicier, a bit more sort of NEIPA style, I tend to find that you get a better sort of control and a better feel for it, or particularly later in the ferment. As long as you can keep the temperature in there after your diet free rise, maybe even 24, 25, you can get a different profile than you could at sort of 16, 17, 18, even 14 we've gone to for some things. But it's about the hop, about how it works. I know some guys are asking about how you control hop creep particularly. As long as you've removed the actual hops from there, most of the creep should occur in that temperature range. So we tend to remove crop out our hops after sort of 2 or 3 days. We've got most of our extraction out of that at that point, and then we leave it another day or so check the PG isn't moving too much. Maybe run a work attenuation limit, and then continue processing it through kill and then pack.
Cool.
Good.
Anything else, Carl?
Oh, no, that's it. It's just about choosing the right ones, really. But like you say, some of the English strains are naturally quite good in terms of producing esters.
Yeah, I think that,
and letting them rip a bit and giving them a bit of temperature so they produce these esters is good too.
a lot of the English styles are actually. I think I said before, you're making the traditional English one, then you might not get esters. So traditionally, English styles produce quite a lot of esters anyway.
Yeah, we've previously forced top cropping strains to bottom crop over time, and that's actually given you quite a good suspension in there as well. So although you're not looking to that to be a primary part of your haze, you can get a good carryover of maybe sort of 10 power 4, 10 power 5 cell counts in pack, which certainly gives you a lot of stability downstream, a lot easier to control.
Good to know that. Didn't know that.
Okay, and then going into fermentation. So we can change the ester profile of the beer by what we can do to it. So you can kind of make your process, you can make the yeast do what your process wants it to do. So things that encourage ester formation is higher temperatures, lower pitch rates and lower O2 addition. So you're basically stressing the yeast out to try and get, that'll encourage ester formation. And same point, reducing trub levels that pass through. If you let the trub levels go through, that can encourage yeast to, it can act as a bit of a yeast food and suppress those esters. CO2 as well. An open vessel like what's in the slideshow there is going to produce a little bit more esters than the small enclosed vessel. Just because of the CO2 content, you're going to get a bit more hydrostatic pressure and a higher CO2 content as well. If you're fermenting under CO2 pressure as well, that might be suppressing some of those enzymes. If, as we mentioned before, you might want to put hops in day 1, day 2 of fermentation, it's possible that this might actually help a little bit of haze formation, as well as the protein level still a little bit higher at that stage of fermentation than at the end, and you put that extra bit of polyphenol in there that can create the complexes that go on and might help produce a little bit more haze. And as we've said, the final PG needs to be around 15. We've seen them creeping up and up and up over time. And we're going to control that, as we said, by grist selection, by the mash conditions, and also by the yeast that we're going to select. I think we've covered a lot of that in the other slides, but yeah, if we want to go over anything. Mark?
No, not really, but I wouldn't be afraid of a high PG, and 10-15 is definitely sort of possibly even the lower end where some of these guys are finishing at the moment. So, well, I know I've put out beers at sort of closer to 10-30, which from my old cast days was a pitching PG. So pitching OG. So things have changed, but yeah, no, it's I think you've got everything.
Yeah, I would say 15 is now minimum. They're going up and up.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Okay, so dry hopping. So generally when we're dry hopping, you want the yeast to come down before we add the hops to it. So the yeast can absorb some of the flavour from the hops, and it's also going to be a bit easier to control the solid content later on. And dry hopping in different stages can actually increase the extraction. Instead of one big dose at a time, if you do 2 smaller doses or 3 smaller doses, you get better extraction from that. So the extraction is different to what you'd get in the boil. We want about diffusion now. So things that can affect that is agitation. So a little bit of mixing is going to encourage the flavours to come out. Temperature and what you do it, which will be interesting to speak to Mark about later on. Generally, the higher the temperature, the better extraction you're going to get. But the standard range seems to be somewhere between 4 and 16 degrees C for dry hopping. And then the time that we leave it on there. I've certainly seen this drop over the years. Beforehand, when we first started dry hopping, we'd kind of say we'd leave it on there for at least a week, and we'll leave it longer and we'll get more. It doesn't seem to be that way. I think it's found that the myrcene, so the spice and herbal flavours in the hops and the linalool, so the floral and fruity flavours, some research basically says they're the same on day 2 as what they are on day 7. It basically suggests you're getting full extraction earlier on. And what can happen as well, the longer that you leave them, those spice and herbal flavours increase, mainly because the linalool is decreasing and being reabsorbed. If you're using pellets, you're going to get better extraction than over leaf. As we said, some of the aroma can be reabsorbed back into the hops. And also the batch size plays quite a big impact as well. If you're doing something on a pilot plot, pilot scale, and then you need to upscale to your big system, you're probably going to add more dry hops to it, just because the vessel size is going to decrease the extraction. Yeah, so Mark, dry hopping.
That's sort of most of the work these days. As you said, everything sort of occurs in there. I think, again, you've just got to look at what you want to get out of your hop. Obviously, those style contents are really important, particularly if you're using any of the big boys, Citra, anything else. I think it's also important not to focus on single hopping. If you're looking at something like Citra, I think I mentioned it earlier, you can get a really sort of like lemongrassy, citrusy, grapefruity flavour from the hop. But as well in there as well, you've got sort of like a rich lychee, guava sort of flavour in the background. If you want to sort of focus on extracting that, perhaps look at using a lower temperature, or certainly a lower concentration. We use, rarely do we use single hops. We use other hops to back them up. So I quite like some heritage varieties, even some English varieties. Browning Cross I'm a big fan of at the moment, as a sort of building block hop, which, if you combine that, although with a smaller proportion with something like Citra, it can give you a very different sort of palate at a different temperature. That's crucial to it, as well as the sort of agitation time frame. As you really pointed out, it is quite quick these days, 2 to 3 days. As you say on your slide, leaving it does get a bit sort of a more acrid, spicy character. But I'd say that myrcene is important. It's very much a stabilizing element for most hop oils. If it's not there in any presence, it's quite good to just leave some of it there. If it's not there, it will sort of dissipate quite quickly. Hops fade fast, so the more stable you can get them, the better. And I think that's sort of the ranging we've been looking to do things. I think when it comes to, if you want to look at sort of certainly producing a beer in a brewery at a level where it's going to be nearly a core beer or something that's more consistency's a driving force with, you probably want to get away from doing it on yeast bio and earlier. You want to certainly control it at a set temperature and a set regime, so that you're not keeping it on there too long and you're not keeping it out there for any period of time. That gives you a smooth transition. You should be able to keep certainly a similar profile from most hops, even from the differences of hop to hop. That also helps with blending hops if you're using 2 or 3 different ones. I think dry hopping actually, certainly in the modern age, so biome transformations came about to try and utilize brewery capacity. So people were adding it earlier, trying to see how quickly you could get throughput, speed up plant work, which is interesting as to now it's sort of actually probably elongating a lot of my plant work. Yeah, so it's definitely crucial to sort of look at your time frame and think about the beer you want at the end of it.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say like Bramling Cross, because anything that you ever read about Bramling Cross, it basically says you're brave if you use it anywhere apart from the boil.
It's oily. It's got a lot in there. It's quite a rich hop. But you do get a wonderful sort of blackcurranty sort of file from it. You've got that myrcene in there, which you can use to build up. So even if you wanted to add that earlier on, use that as an extraction point, and then sort of drop bits and pieces in there. Use that as a building block or a stabilizer. That I find quite interesting.
Oh, that's good.
Anything else, Carl?
No, I've just learned a whole lot of stuff there. Nice one, Mark.
I doubt that, Carl. I doubt that very much.
Yeah, I thought I'd done research. Okay. Next one. Yeah, hop burn. So you can also get quite a lot of hop burn on these styles as well, which is kind of like coming across as a bit of a vegetable bitterness from a lot of increased polyphenols from dry hopping. And basically the polyphenols increase the perceived bitterness. Now, going on through dry hopping, Basically, the hop burn comes from over extraction. So while we want to mix the hops up to make sure we get as much out of it as we can, if we're doing too much, we're going to extract too much. We're going to get too many hop polyphenols within there, and then we're going to get the hop burn. Again, the temperature's got a little bit to play in there as well, and making sure that we get the beer off the hops within a decent time, so it stops the extraction. Do you see much hop burn coming through, Mark, in any yogurt?
To be honest with you, to a certain extent, we almost look for it and aim to pack around about the time you've got it, mainly because of just how quickly they fade through. If you're looking for sort of more juicy sort of hops, if we're packing a beer and it's not going to hit the shelves for 2 to 3 weeks, which we're getting towards now with our sort of size and footprint, we want to have it slightly more acrid, so it's died off a little bit further downstream. So to actually add more hops, to add more thiols that are going to dissipate and change in time, it is quite important for us at the moment to sort of aim for that. But you've got to be careful. The difference between being hop burn and hop acrid is quite a fine line to work. So it's just experience improving about what you need. A lot of people I've seen is sort of just go on kilos, and then, oh, we put 40 kilos in this, or it's a 40 kilo dry hop. That works very well if you're using sort of the big boys, Simcoe, Citra, Mosaic, but you something like Eldorado or Galaxy, then, you know, you probably want to up that a little bit and level that out a bit.
Yeah, anything to add, Cal?
I know, just what Mark said there, I find quite interesting, because we kind of buy hops more often than not. Certainly the big boys buy hops on alpha acid. And yet, the amount of hops now that are going in, it doesn't matter what the alpha is, because you're not going to isomerize it. You know, we don't really get that much information from the hop merchants about the levels of essential oils and beta acids, which again play a part in terms of flavour and bitterness perception. So that might be something we can speak to them about going forward, and that will give us even more information to put the right amount of hops in at the right time.
Certainly nothing I thought about actually when I was doing hop contracts. But is that something you're thinking about, Mark, moving forward?
Very heavily, very, very heavily. I mean, some of the guys, the more experience they're getting from the American market, the more it's sort of feeding over here. So most of my guys, you know, Yakima, Simply, Hopsteiner, do provide sort of hop breakdown, particularly thiol contents, right the way across it, from myrcene, alphas, betas. In fact, you know, back in the days from buying hops based on alpha acids and quality and that, it's almost, I haven't even thought about it for about 2 years, to be honest with you. Good. So yeah, they are giving you much more of a spec broken down, SBC measured, so you've got to convert it, but it's certainly coming back into the market now. I think particularly if you're home brewing, most home brewing hops will have a certain breakdown on the packet. I know Yakima Chief have led that quite heavily.
That's good.
Yeah, I'm looking for that. And then lastly, we'll come on to oxidation. Now, oxidizing it, we basically, in the past, with oxygen levels, we'd just be worried about stale flavours, paper, wallpaper, and cardboard flavours, and basically poor shelf life. But nowadays, with much more hops being added, we're also getting this darkening of beers as well. So there's nothing takes away from really good process parameters and controlling the oxygen in the brewery by good practice. But we've also got a few other options that have been around for many, many years. We certainly used this early on when I started brewing, but they were taken away because they were seen as not being particularly nice to add. But I think they're starting to come back a little bit now. So we've got sodium or potassium metabisulfate that basically binds ions and reduces oxygen. But you do need to be careful about allergens on that. Anything over 10 ppm in the UK, you need to label as an allergen. And ascorbic acid as well. Really, really good as an oxygen scavenger. But if you've got any heavy metals within your water, it can actually act in the opposite way. Actually increase the oxidation properties. But normally really, really good when you use them together. And as I've said on the last presentation I did, peracetic acid, it is an oxidizing agent. So manage what you do with PAA and try to keep it away from your beer. So Is there anything particular you make sure that the brewery does to keep your oxygen levels as low as possible, Mark?
Other than best practice, no, I don't think there's much you can do. You know, and I think common sense also utilizes quite a bit. If you're doing in a sort of brewery atmosphere, don't be afraid to waste beer that's come into oxygen contact. So certainly purging lines a little bit more fluidly, accepting the loss sometimes is also quite good. Certainly for the canning lines, you know, we're first couple of cases of cans rather than just the first couple of cans. And what that's going to give us is, you know, stability in a market force that's quite good. Also just being ruthless with people's setups and set downs. Make sure that if there are stops, make sure that it gets ditched. You know, I think if you want the best product out there, you've just got to accept that to get that there, it's going to be quite crucial. I always thought for a long time that if I'd be leaving a lot of yeast in things, it'd actually give me quite a little bit more stability. But although the flavours perhaps aren't that bad in classical off flavours, you know, papery, trans-2-nonial, you certainly see discoloration, you certainly see hop degradation, and in many ways, because you're using super radicals, you can see referments pick up quite rapidly. So, you know, I think oxygen control's almost essential.
Yeah.
Carl, your career would have been around managing oxygen control, I'd have thought.
Very much so. I mean, I was fortunate enough to be working in pretty large breweries where they had deaerated liquor, you know, so that really helped. But as Mark said, it's just about being sensible, you know, from the minute it's finished fermenting, the yeast's used up all the oxygen. And so whenever you move it, you just do it carefully. You purge lines, you purge tanks before you move the beer. And also putting a layer of CO2. If the beer is going to be in the tank for any length of time whilst you dry hopping, then just put a little bit of CO2 on there. CO2 is heavier than air, so it'll sit on top of the beer and it'll protect it from oxygen that way. Yeah, just keep it as low as possible, and then make sure that whatever filling equipment you're using, you're not getting too much pickup from bright beer tank into final pack. Make sure you're doing total pack oxygens, and that's as low as possible, because it doesn't take long for it to spoil things.
Not at all. Not at all. Right. Cheers, guys. That is that's the presentation. So huge thanks, Mark, for coming on. And,
Welcome.
Yeah, nice one, mate.
Yeah, I see it.
Hello. That was huge. Thank you, guys. We do have quite a few questions, but we also don't have a huge amount of time. So I think we'll try and rattle through as many as we can in 10 minutes. A lot of them are certainly about hops, and sort of roundabout. So I guess a couple of different things, some about kit and some about types of hops. So one about pellet versus leaf, you know, pros and cons, and the other about whirlpool versus hop back. So I wonder if Mark could maybe just talk around those sort of two topics. Do you see, are you using leaf at all in your brewery, Mark? Or
No, not anymore. We were using it in the kettle for a while, mainly to get through some leaf stock that we had when we moved to kits, which I think everyone's had to do at some point. But no, we very much use pellet all the way through. I would actually suggest that certainly modern dry hopping, big hazy IPA dry hopping with leaf was practically impossible given the amount of other things that are still remaining in the hop, big, and even just the air contact that's going to be in them by the time you've actually managed to get them into the kettle, even forcing or into the fermenter, even forcing them in there is almost impossible. I'd go as far as to say that if it wasn't for hop pellets, most of the modern brewing industry or the craft brewing industry wouldn't exist. I know a lot of people place it down to the American hop cultivation, but it's very much pellet focused. As for hop backs against whirlpool, again, you can get the agitation with the whirlpool, so you get better extraction. You can also control your temperatures a little bit more if they are in kettle. You know, you can have a temperature probe, you can cool down your heat exchanger, things like that. So you can start adding it, you know, Mike said sub 80, but sort of between 80 and 60, perhaps for most of our windows, depending on the hops we're using. And that's a lot more concurrent. Hop backs, definitely more classical, a lot more for leaf hops, probably a lot better for leaf hopping to absorb it if you are forcing that wort in there, and then you can at least cool down with it, get a little bit more isomerization out of that.
Good stuff. Okay. And then around dry hopping, someone's asking about, would you recommend the use of something like a hop rocket? So we're starting to see these come into the market quite a lot now.
Yeah, they're wonderful. It certainly keeps your oxygen content down, so you can purge through, and it gives you a lot more control. You can actually get better extraction. We don't use one for our hops, mainly because the amount of hot rockets we'd have to buy. At the moment, it'd be good to go, but we're certainly using a lot of things like coconut and fruit additions, which is very handy. But at the moment, we're still dry hopping through the top, so oxygen control is quite crucial at that point.
I +1 for hot rockets. I was a big fan of them.
I missed that there, Mike. Can you come a little bit closer to the screen?
Oh, it's scary that. Yeah, I was a big +1 for hop rockets and some hop dosing, other kind of hop dosing. They can transform your beers. I like them.
Good stuff. What about the splits between Whirlpool hops and dry hops? So where do you start if, when you're designing a recipe and deciding how much should go in at Whirlpool and how much should go in at dry hop? I mean, is less more when it comes to dry hopping? Is there a law of diminishing returns?
I think for time frame, there's definitely a law of diminishing returns. I think if you're expecting to use less to then have it on for longer, you're probably going to have an awful lot less time to actually get that extraction right, particularly for the sort of fruitier, softer tropical flavors. With regards to Whirlpool, you are heating it. You are going to get a different extraction. You may lose some thiols and gain some myrcene. You've got to sort of balance out what you want from the hop. I think. Also, you're also limited to how effectively you can utilize a kettle. I think if you're going to put 40 kilos into a kettle, you've got to accept the fact that you're going to lose more beer, which is never wanted. But yeah, I don't think there's any set split. I think it's down to the hops you're using and how carefully you want to sort of add them.
Very good. Just one, I think you've already mentioned this when you were chatting there, Mark, about Protofloc and Irish moss. You're absolutely not using those in the kettle. Is that fair to say?
Not for these style of beers, though I have done in the past for this sort of style of beer. It really depends on what sort of hazing element you want into it. I think, again, if you're going to add things like Vienna in there, I'd recommend maybe a tiny bit, but then you're going down a dangerous road of sort of moderating your Protofloc, and it does get a bit awful. So for me, it's all or nothing.
Okay, fair enough. One for the Crisp guys, how to avoid stuck mashes with unmalted grist additions.
It really comes down to hulls. If you can use rice hulls, oat hulls, great. We do a product called 25 flaked oats. Those have got the hulls on them, so that can help sort of keep the bed open, but you're still getting the benefit of having that material in there to give you that smoothness and the soluble fibres that oats impart into the beer.
Yeah, certainly the danger of using anything without the hull, so like naked oats or porridge oats, things like that. So getting a mixture between cereals with and without the hull is a good idea, or just buying in hulls.
On the website as well. That's a good read on that one.
What was that?
We've got the blog on the website. That's quite a good read on using flaked oats in.
You're absolutely right. Yep, go to crispmalt.com, and that Mike has put that up in the past few weeks. Very good. One on hop creep, which is a pretty big topic. I think you touched on it a little bit, Mark, in terms of doing water attenuation limits. But how do you manage hop creep if you're canning and you can't pasteurize your beer?
We don't pasteurize any of our beer, and a lot of it is just a bit more time. But as I said, you want to get rid of those hops from there. Once you haven't got hop matter, or certainly 90% of your hop matter in there, you're not going to see some of that breakdown. Hopefully most of the work's been done, be it enzymically or through any other chemistry. Hopefully most of it's been done, so then you just got to play the waiting game a little bit, give it another bit of time. Worst attenuation lips, nice if you can do them. Most people probably could give you a jiffy effort, but I wouldn't suggest doing it away from a lab. That's certainly how we manage it. I also plan that into the recipe as well. So if I'm aiming to finish at 10:20, I modulate my mash tun to make sure that I finish at about 10:25. Make sure that I do have a 5-point hop creep.
So almost expected then. And do you get it more with certain types of hops?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I particularly sort of like the high thioled ones. You are seeing quite a bit. I know if you sort of pack in Citra and Mosaic together, you're going to see a lot of it. Also volumes, quite crucial over it. It's hard to predict just where it sort of ends up. So I think just experience on that more than anything else. I wouldn't worry too much if you are bottling. You're going to see 2-3 points anyway, lose over time with the amount of things you've got in there. As long as your bottle can take it, then you should be okay.
Very good. Very good. One on some water additions. So do you make all the water additions in the mash and sparge? Some breweries adding calcium chloride towards the end of the boil. Have you heard of salts being added in the boil?
I personally haven't. We do most of ours, certainly salt addition go in on the mash because that's where most of the work needs to do, and then you're basically working towards the boil anyway. I know acidifying the wort, particularly in ferment or at copper, we have done, but more as a sort of problem-solving effort than anything I'd build into recipe. Certainly looking at different acids do give you different sort of tonal flavors. I mean, citric and lactic. Lactic can give you a bit more creaminess in there than citric, and it can easily also do the work that you need to do buffer against your grain. But Carl might know.
Good stuff. One on malt here, Carl. What levels of Ki and DP are we targeting in the malts for this style of beer? Which is this is a fairly tough question, but if we're really just talking about base malts and using standard sort of extra pale or Maris or anything in that area, British well modified malts are typically going to be sort of 43 to 48 Ki and minimum of 45 DP, although typically a bit higher than that. So I'm cheating because I looked up the answer while the presentation was going on.
Very good. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. It's just maybe if you go something slightly higher nitrogen, slightly less mod, which would be more kind of like a lager malt, let's say, that tends to be higher nitrogen, lower mod, if you were finding you're having problems. But generally, I'd use mash temperature and thickness to control the non-fermentable part, the kind of the attenuation, to be honest.
And I know there's a lot of homebrewers on, and you don't always have access to the certificates of analysis, but go with the typical ones on the websites of your maltsters. All of our specifications are on our website. You can check them all out there. But if you do find that you've purchased a malt that's got slightly higher DP, that's going to have a bit more enzyme activity, then play around with that mash temperature, get it up a bit, and you shouldn't, because as the guys have been saying throughout the presentation, you really want to preserve a good bit of gravity at the end to give that fullness to the beer. So you don't want it going too low. Another one on hops here, and we'll just take two more, I think, because we're running out of time here. But what tips can you give to reduce polyphenol extraction from hops?
Good question. Not much. Your polyphenol content is going to be there to a certain extent. It can help and hinder your haze depending on the amount that you're going into it, particularly when you're looking at binding. I don't know if Carl's got any more on this, but certainly for us, it's not something that we consider.
Carl? Yep. By the same on that.
Pretty much the same. Okay, fair enough. Very good. And I'm going to take this as the last one. How many IBUs do you recommend before the end of boil? So are you adding any? You're not really adding any hops before the end of boil, just whirlpool?
So most of our IBUs are actually counted in for about probably about 20 to 30 for most of the actual beer. And that's about it.
And that's all coming from Whirlpool, Mark?
Yeah, most of that's coming from Whirlpool.
Yeah, very good. Okay, that's us done an hour. I'm so sorry for people who haven't had their questions answered yet. But it's been really comprehensive today. I hope that you've got enough out of it, guys. And remember that the presentation will be available to watch again online. I'll get that up over the coming days, and the slides will be available as well. Thank you so much to our panel, to Carl, to Mike, and to Mark for joining us and giving up his time today. And we're going to be back again in 2 weeks' time. We're taking a break next week, but we're back in 2 weeks, and we're going to be talking about West Coast IPAs. So we've done something in the East, and there we're going to switch over to the big, bitter IPAs of the US West Coast, which arguably started the craft beer revolution over there. So do join us for that. The invite will be going out on social media and on the website fairly soon. Thank you, guys, and
cheers, guys. Thank you.
Enjoy the rest of your day.
Nice.
Cheers, wherever you are in the world.
Good to see you.
Thank you.
Cheers.